In the winter of 1913, in a comfortable house on the shores of Lake Zurich, a man in his late 30s sat alone in a study and deliberately allowed himself to go mad. He did not call it that, not exactly. He called it an experiment, a confrontation with the unconscious. But the truth was simpler and stranger. Carl Gustav Jung, one of the most respected psychiatrists in Europe, closed his eyes, let the floor beneath him fall away, and plunged into a darkness he was not certain he would ever leave. What he found there would take him nearly 16 years to record. He painted it, he wrote to it, he built it stone by stone in a tower by the water, and when he finally emerged he had in his possession a set of ideas that would reshape how human beings think about themselves. Words like archetype, shadow, the collective unconscious. Words we still use today, often without knowing where they came from. But here is what is less often said about Carl Jung, and what this story is really about. He spent his entire life teaching that wholeness requires confronting what you would rather not know about yourself. He called this hidden self the shadow, the part of the psyche we push into darkness because we cannot bear to look at it. And yet the man who gave the world that idea may never have fully looked at his own. Before he was the sage of Küsnacht, he was a young doctor who fell in love with a patient and destroyed her, at least for a time. Before he was the elder statesman of depth psychology, he was a man who edited journals under the Nazi regime and wrote passages that distinguished between the Aryan and Jewish soul. Before he was the wise old man in the stone tower, he was someone who projected his own unconscious onto the peoples of Africa and the American Southwest, and called what he saw there primitive. The man who mapped the depth of the human mind left behind a record that is, in places, very difficult to read, and the question that has haunted his biographers ever since is whether Carl Jung ever really understood what his own work was asking of him. Whether he saw the shadow in the mirror, or whether, like so many of the patients he treated, he spent his life looking everywhere but there. To understand any of it, we have to go back, slowly, carefully, to a world that no longer exists. To a small Swiss village in the late 1800s, to a boy who heard things no one else could hear, and to the first fracture in a psyche that would spend the rest of its life trying to become whole. So settle in. This is a long story, and we have all the time in the world to tell it. The house where Carl Jung was born stood in the village of Kesswil, on the Swiss shore of Lake Constance, and it was not a happy house. His father, Johann Paul Achilles Jung, was a pastor in the Swiss Reformed Church, a man who had once been a scholar of Oriental languages, who had written his doctoral dissertation on Arabic, and who had, somewhere along the way, lost his faith and never found another. He preached sermons he no longer believed. He performed rituals he suspected meant nothing, and he moved his family from parish to parish, always restless, always disappointed, always waiting for something that never came. Carl's mother, Emily, was stranger still. She was a large woman, heavy and warm in person, but prone to disappearances. Not physical ones, but something worse. She would be there, in the kitchen or the parlour, and then suddenly she would not be there at all. Her eyes would go distant, her voice would change, she would say things that seemed to come from someone else entirely. Years later, Jung would write that his mother had two personalities. The first was ordinary, predictable, the wife of a village pastor. The second was uncanny, archaic, and ruthless. A voice from another world that emerged without warning and knew things it should not know. He learned, as a very young child, that his mother could not be trusted. Not because she was cruel, but because she was not always there. The village of Laufen, where the family moved when Carl was 6 months old, was dominated by an old castle and the roar of the Rhine Falls, the largest waterfall in Europe, pouring over the rocks with a sound that never stopped. The parsonage sat near the river, and near the cemetery, and near the church where his father performed the rites that no longer moved him. Carl's earliest memory was of lying in a pram in the garden, looking up at the sky through the leaves. Later, he would remember the sunlight, the warmth, the profound sense of well-being that came before anything else. But his second memory was of fear. He was perhaps 3 years old, and he woke in the night to see a faint, luminous figure coming through his bedroom door, just a head, detached from any body, floating in the dark. He pulled the blankets over his eyes and waited for it to pass. He did not tell anyone. He understood even then that there were things you did not say. The parsonage was surrounded by death. Funeral processions passed through the village regularly, and Karl watched them from the windows, the men in black, the horses with their black plumes, the wooden boxes lowered into the earth behind the church. He did not know precisely what death meant, but he knew it had something to do with the graves and with the dark holes, and with a particular fear that arose whenever his mother spoke of Jesus. Jesus, she told him, took people away. At night, while you slept. He was supposed to find this comforting. He did not. Instead, the idea fused in his young mind with the graves and the funerals and the Rhine roaring in the distance, and produced a terror that would shape the rest of his life. A suspicion that beneath the comfortable surface of things, beneath the prayers and the rituals and the daylight, there was something else, something vast and dark and waiting. When Karl was 3, his mother disappeared. Not metaphorically this time. She was hospitalized, he was not told why, and she was gone for several months. He was left in the care of an aunt and a maid, and he remembered that time, decades later, with a precision that suggested it had never quite healed. He remembered the eczema that broke out on his skin. He remembered the separation as a wound that went deeper than absence. And he remembered developing, from that point forward, a profound distrust of the word love. When women said it, he believed they did not mean it. Not really. Not in a way that could be counted on. There was always something underneath. Always another face behind the face. His mother returned, eventually. But she was not the same. Or perhaps he was not the same. He found himself watching her more carefully now, waiting for the moment when her eyes would change, when the other one would emerge. He learned to read the signs. He learned to be careful. And he began, without quite realizing it, to construct another life. A secret life. An inner life that belonged only to him. It started with a game. He was perhaps 10 years old when he carved a small wooden figure, a little man, 2 inches tall, dressed in a frock coat and top hat. He painted it, hid it in his pencil case, and placed the pencil case in the attic of the parsonage, in a space where no one would ever find it. With the little man he left a smooth, oblong stone from the Rhine, painted to look like something ancient. He would visit them, secretly, when he was alone. He would add tiny scrolls of paper, written in a made-up language. He told no one. The ritual calmed him in a way nothing else could. It gave him a sense of power, not over the world, but over his own terror of it. Years later, reading about Chiringa stones among Aboriginal Australians, he would recognise what he had been doing. He had been performing spontaneously a ritual as old as the human species. He had been externalising his soul, keeping it safe. But at the time, he only knew that he had a secret, and that the secret made him whole. There is a scene that Jung described many times in his later writings, and it takes place on a bright autumn day in his 12th year. He was walking home from school in Basel, where the family had moved a few years earlier. The cathedral rose above him, its towers golden in the afternoon light. It was beautiful. It was sacred. And without warning, a thought began to form at the edge of his mind. He did not let it finish. He knew, somehow, that this thought was dangerous, that if he let it complete itself, something terrible would happen. He pushed it away. He walked faster. He tried to think of other things, but the thought kept pressing, like something alive, demanding to be born. For 3 days and 3 nights he fought it. He barely slept. He barely ate. He went to school and sat at his desk and held the thought at bay with every ounce of will he possessed. And all the while he wrestled with a paradox that would define his entire intellectual life. If God was good, and God was all-knowing, and God had created Carl Jung, then God had also created this thought. God wanted him to think it. But the thought was blasphemous. How could God want blasphemy? On the 3rd night, exhausted, he let go. He saw in his mind's eye the beautiful cathedral gleaming in the sunlight. He saw above it God sitting on his golden throne. And then he let himself see, an enormous turd falling from beneath that throne, crashing through the roof of the cathedral, shattering the walls, destroying everything. And the moment he allowed the image to complete itself, instead of damnation, he felt an overwhelming sense of grace, of release, of being loved by something beyond all human understanding. What he took from that experience, and it became one of the foundational stories of his self-mythology, was that God did not want obedience. God did not want the comforting prayers and the Sunday rituals and the faith that never questioned. God wanted authenticity. God wanted you to think the forbidden thought, to see what was really there. His father, he realized, had spent his life refusing to do this. His father had buried his doubts, performed his rituals, and slowly died inside. Carl would not make the same mistake. He would descend into the darkness. He would look at what others turned away from, and he would find there, in the depths, something holy. It was a founding myth, of course, a story he told to make sense of himself. And like all founding myths, it left certain things out. The Basel of Jung's adolescence was a city of considerable intellectual ferment. The university was ancient and distinguished. The families were old and wealthy. And the young Carl Gustav Jung was desperately, painfully aware that he belonged to neither. His father's income was modest. His clothes were second-hand. He walked to school while other boys rode in carriages, and he felt keenly the difference between his family and theirs. He had the mind for that world. He knew he did. But he did not have the name or the money or the social ease that would have made him part of it. What he had instead was a sense of doubleness. He called it later personality number 1 and personality number 2. Number 1 was the schoolboy, awkward and ordinary, stumbling through his classes, prone to fainting spells and what his teachers called laziness. Number 2 was something else entirely, something ancient, something that wore an 18th century costume in his imagination, something that remembered things from before his birth. Number 2 was connected to the stones and the water and the vast interior spaces that opened when he was alone. Number 2 knew things. For years, Jung moved between these two selves, never quite sure which one was real. Number 1 wanted to fit in, to succeed, to be like the other boys. Number 2 wanted to descend, to contemplate, to vanish into the inner world. Number 1 was embarrassed by Number 2. Number 2 was contemptuous of Number 1. This division between the surface self and the deeper self, between the adaptation and the truth, would become the central theme of Jung's entire psychology. But it began here, in adolescence, as a private torment that he could not explain to anyone. He read voraciously. He discovered Goethe's Faust and recognized in it something of his own predicament. The scholar who has mastered all the outer knowledge and finds it empty, who makes a bargain with darker powers to find what really matters. He read Schopenhauer and found there a philosophy of the will and the unconscious that spoke to his own experience. He read Nietzsche and felt the vertigo of a world without the old certainties, where the only imperative was to become who you are. But he also read his father's theology books and found them hollow. His father would come to him sometimes late at night, wanting to talk about the religious doubts that tormented him. Carl could not help. He saw his father's faith dying, and he saw too that his father could not bear to let it go. Paul Jung died in 1896, when Carl was 21 years old. He was not yet 46. He had never resolved his crisis of faith, never found the deeper truth his son was seeking. He simply faded, and then he was gone. Carl was left with a choice about what to become. The choice was not obvious. He was good at many things: languages, history, archaeology, natural science. He was drawn to the ancient world, to the mysteries, to the secret knowledge encoded in symbols and myths. But there was no profession in that, no way to make a living. And then, in his final year of medical school, he opened a textbook on psychiatry. The author was Richard von Krafft-Ebing, and the preface contained a single phrase that changed everything. Krafft-Ebing described psychiatry as a field characterized by the peculiar difficulty that its subject, the psyche, was also its instrument. The mind studying itself, the subjective examining the subjective. Jung's heart began to pound. Here, at last, was a discipline that united everything: the biological and the spiritual, the scientific and the philosophical, the outer world and the inner one. Here was a way to explore the depths professionally, to make a life out of the descent. He announced his decision to specialize in psychiatry, and his professors were baffled. Psychiatry in those days was not a prestigious field. It was a backwater. The patients were largely untreatable. The asylums were warehouses. A young man of Jung's intelligence was expected to become a surgeon or an internist, not to waste his talents on the mad. But Jung understood something his professors did not. He understood that the mad were not simply broken machines. They were human beings who had become lost in the depths, the same depths he had been navigating since childhood. and if he could learn to speak their language, if he could follow them into the darkness and find his way back, then perhaps he could bring them back too. In December of 1900, at 25 years old, Carl Gustav Jung took up a position at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, and the descent, in earnest, began. The Burghölzli was a world unto itself. It sat on a hillside overlooking the city, a sprawling complex of buildings surrounded by gardens and walls, and within those walls some 400 patients lived in varying states of disturbance. There were catatonics who had not spoken in years. There were paranoiacs who believed the doctors were poisoning their food. There were women who screamed through the night, and men who sat in corners, rocking, mumbling conversations with presences no one else could see. The director was Eugen Bleuler, a quietly brilliant man who believed, against the prevailing wisdom of the time, that psychotic patients could be understood. Not merely managed, not merely sedated, but actually heard. He expected his staff to spend time with them, to listen to their ravings, to treat their delusions as communications rather than noise. Jung threw himself into this work with an intensity that alarmed his colleagues. He arrived at the hospital at 6 in the morning and often did not leave until 10 at night. He slept in a room on the grounds. He took his meals with the patients. He immersed himself in their world completely, as if he were conducting fieldwork in a foreign country, which, in a sense, he was. He learned their languages. He mapped their delusions. He discovered that what appeared to be meaningless babble often contained beneath the surface a kind of terrible poetry, fragments of myth, echoes of trauma, symbolic expressions of conflicts the patients themselves could not name, and he began to develop a method, a way of probing the unconscious that did not require the patient to lie on a couch and free associate for years, a faster route to the hidden depths. He called it the word association test. The principle was simple. You read a list of words to the patient: tree, mother, death, knife, love, and you measured how long it took them to respond with the first word that came to mind. You noted when they hesitated, when they stumbled, when their pulse quickened or their breath caught. And what Jung discovered, over hundreds of trials, was that certain words produced disturbances that the conscious mind could not hide. The hesitation, the physiological reaction, the odd associations, they all pointed to something, a buried memory, a repressed emotion, a secret shame. He called these clusters of charged material complexes. A complex was not a disease. It was a normal structure of the psyche, a knot of feeling and memory that had gathered around some core experience and taken on a life of its own. Everyone had them. The question was whether you knew about yours, or whether they ran your life from the shadows. The word complex entered the language from Jung's work at the Burghölzli. Inferiority complex, mother complex. We still use these terms today, often without knowing where they came from. But the word association test was only the beginning. Jung was looking for something larger. He was looking for a map of the entire unconscious, not just its local disturbances, and for that he needed a guide. In 1906 he sent a copy of his research to a doctor in Vienna whose theories had captivated the psychiatric world, a man who claimed to have discovered the key to all neurosis, the hidden engine beneath every symptom and every dream. The doctor's name was Sigmund Freud, and the reply when it came would change both their lives forever. The correspondence began cautiously, two professionals exchanging research, circling each other with the careful respect of men who sensed they were not quite equals. Freud was 50, Jung was 31. Freud was Jewish, Viennese, the founder of a controversial new discipline called psychoanalysis. Jung was Swiss, Protestant, the scion of a different intellectual tradition entirely. But from the first letters something else was present, a charge, a mutual recognition that went beyond the professional. Freud had been waiting for years for an intellectual heir. His movement was still small, still marginal, still dismissed by the medical establishment as a kind of elaborate speculation about sex. He needed someone younger, someone from outside the Jewish circle, someone with institutional credibility to carry the work forward. Jung, for his part, had been waiting for a father, not the one who had died, broken and faithless, but a spiritual father, a man who had descended into the depths and returned with real knowledge, not empty rituals. They met for the first time in Vienna, in February of 1907. They talked for 13 hours straight. Jung was dazzled. Here was a man who took the unconscious seriously, who had built an entire system around it, who spoke of dreams and symptoms and slips of the tongue as if they were the most important things in the world. Freud's mind was quick and penetrating, his conversation electric, his certainty absolute. Freud, for his part, saw in Jung the future of psychoanalysis, a man of brilliance and stature who could take the movement out of the Viennese consulting rooms and into the wider world. He began referring to Jung, in letters, as his son and heir, his crown prince. The language of those early years was astonishingly intimate. They wrote to each other weekly, sometimes daily, sharing dreams, sharing cases, sharing the most private workings of their minds. Freud analysed Jung's dreams. Jung deferred to Freud's interpretations. There was beneath the intellectual exchange something that looked very much like love. But there was also, from the beginning, a fault line. Freud's system placed sexuality at the centre of everything. Every neurosis, every dream, every symptom ultimately traced back to sexual wishes, sexual conflicts, sexual traumas. Jung was never entirely convinced. He had seen things in his patients, religious visions, mythological imagery, what he would later call archetypal material, that did not seem to reduce to sex. He suspected that the unconscious contained more than Freud was willing to admit. For a time, he kept these doubts to himself. The relationship was too precious, too charged, too necessary to risk. He played the role of the loyal son, even when the son had begun to disagree with the father, and then a woman arrived at the Burg Hölzli, and everything began to unravel. Her name was Sabine Spielrein. She was 18 years old when she was admitted to the hospital in August of 1904. She arrived in a state of profound disturbance, laughing and weeping, unable to look anyone in the face, making strange involuntary movements with her hands and head. The admission notes describe tics, grimaces, a profound aversion to being touched. She came from a wealthy Jewish family in Rostov-on-Don, in southern Russia. Her father was a merchant. Her mother was educated, ambitious, and severe. The family spoke multiple languages. They expected great things from their children. What the family did not discuss, and what the admission notes only hint at, was what had happened to Sabina before she arrived. She had been beaten by her father regularly and severely throughout her childhood. She had been humiliated in ways that had left deep marks on her psyche, and the beatings had produced, alongside the trauma, something else. Something that confused and shamed her far more than the violence itself. She had been aroused by them. This was the secret she carried into the Burg Hölzli. This was the knot at the centre of her complex, and the young doctor assigned to her case, Carl Gustav Jung, was about to become entangled in it completely. Jung was 29 when Sabina arrived. He was recently married to Emma Rauschenbach, a woman of intelligence, beauty, and considerable wealth, whose family fortune would support him for the rest of his life. Emma was pregnant with their first child. The future, by any reasonable measure, was secure. But security was never quite what Jung was after. He began treating Sabina with the methods he had been developing. The word association test, careful listening, attention to dreams. And what he found was not a broken mind, but a brilliant one. Sabina was intelligent, passionate, hungry for knowledge. Her illness, he came to believe, was not a failure of reason, but an excess of it. A psyche at war with itself, unable to reconcile the forbidden desires that her upbringing had taught her to despise. The treatment worked. Within a year, Sabina was well enough to leave the hospital. She enrolled at the University of Zurich to study medicine. She wanted, she told Jung, to become a psychiatrist herself. And somewhere in those months, the boundary between doctor and patient began to blur. The exact nature of what happened remains disputed. Jung, in later years, would minimize it, would speak of a youthful indiscretion, an emotional entanglement that never quite became physical. The letters tell another story. Sabina's diary tells another story still. What is clear is that by 1908, there was something between them that was far more than therapeutic. She called it love. She believed they were destined to have a child together. A hero child, she fantasized, who would be called Siegfried and would unite their two bloodlines, Germanic and Jewish, in a new synthesis. Jung, for his part, seems to have encouraged these fantasies, at least for a time, even as he kept them hidden from his wife. The affair, if that is the right word, was an open secret at the hospital. Colleagues whispered. Rumours circulated. Jung's position became precarious, and then Sabina's mother found out. What followed was not, by the standards of the time, unusual. a family discovering that a doctor had become inappropriately involved with their daughter, letters of complaint, demands for accountability, the threat of scandal. What was unusual was what Jung did next. He wrote to Sabina's mother, and he blamed Sabina. He described her as having tried to seduce him. He implied that her emotional instability made her an unreliable narrator. He positioned himself as the victim of an obsessive former patient who had misread professional concern for romantic interest. The letter survives. It is difficult to read, and yet, at the same time, Jung was writing letters to Sabina herself in which he acknowledged the relationship, expressed his turmoil, and seemed genuinely anguished about the damage he had done. The man who blamed her to her mother wept over her in private. This is the first clear glimpse of something that would recur throughout Jung's life, a pattern of ethical compartmentalization so extreme that it is hard, sometimes, to believe we are reading about the same person. He seemed capable of holding contradictory positions simultaneously, of believing one thing in one context and another thing in another, of splitting himself in ways that his own theory should have warned him against. The shadow, he would later write, is the part of ourselves we cannot see. It is the Mr. Hyde to our Dr. Jekyll, the repository of everything we have disowned. And the great danger of the shadow is not that it will disappear, but that it will act through us without our knowledge. Did Jung see, in that moment, that his shadow was writing letters to Mrs. Spielrein, that the man who blamed the patient was himself the patient's shadow, projected outward? Perhaps, or perhaps not. The record is silent on what he felt when he sealed those envelopes. What is certain is that the affair, and the letters, and the web of deception would reach Sigmund Freud, and that Freud too would become entangled in the mess. Jung confessed to Freud in a letter that revealed far less than it concealed. He wrote of a patient who had made him the object of her erotic fantasies, who had spread rumours, who had tried to compromise him. He positioned himself once again as the victim. Freud's response was surprisingly gentle. These things happen, he implied. The transference, the patient's tendency to project powerful feelings onto the analyst, was a known hazard of the work. The important thing was to manage it, to maintain boundaries, to learn from the experience. But Freud also knew more than Jung realized. Sabina had written to him directly. She had told her side of the story, and Freud, reading between the lines, understood that his crown prince was not telling him the whole truth. He did not confront Jung directly. Not yet. The relationship was too valuable, the alliance too important. But a seed of doubt had been planted, and over the next several years, as the two men argued about sexuality and religion, and the ultimate nature of the unconscious, that seed would grow into a rupture that neither would ever fully heal. Sabina Spielrein, meanwhile, survived. More than survived. She completed her medical degree. She wrote a dissertation on schizophrenia that impressed both Freud and Jung. She went to Vienna, became part of Freud's circle, contributed to the early development of psychoanalysis. Her paper on the destructive instinct, the drive toward dissolution that she believed underlay both sexuality and death, anticipated ideas Freud himself would not develop until years later. She returned to Russia after the revolution, opened a psychoanalytic clinic for children in Moscow, trained a generation of Soviet analysts. She married, had children of her own, built a life far from Zurich and the young doctor who had once made her believe in Siegfried. In 1942, the Nazis entered Rostov-on-Don. Sabina Spielrein, along with her two daughters, was marched to a ravine outside the city and shot. The story of her death was not known for decades. The story of her life was not known for longer. It was only in the 1970s, when a scholar discovered a cache of her diaries and letters in the basement of a Geneva archive, that the full picture began to emerge, and that the myth of the Sage of Küsnacht acquired its first deep crack. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. In the years after the Spielrein affair, Jung was still ascending. He became the president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. He travelled to America with Freud, lectured at Clark University, found himself welcomed into the higher circles of the psychiatric world. The relationship with Freud was still intact, if strained. The future still seemed bright. And then, in 1912, everything fell apart. The break came over ideas, ostensibly. Jung published a book called Transformations and Symbols of the Libido, in which he proposed that the energy Freud called libido was not exclusively sexual. It was a life force, a creative drive that could express itself in many forms, including the religious and the mythological. He argued that the unconscious contained not just personal memories and repressed wishes, but something older and stranger, a collective layer shared by all humanity, populated by primordial images that appeared in myths and dreams and visions across every culture. Freud read the book and understood immediately what it meant. His crown prince was defecting. The son was overthrowing the father. The correspondence turned bitter. The letters, once so intimate, became cold and formal, and finally stopped altogether. In January of 1913, Freud wrote his last letter to Jung. It was 4 sentences long. What followed, for Jung, was collapse. He called it his confrontation with the unconscious. He would later describe it as a controlled experiment, a voluntary descent into the depths. But the notes from those years, and the paintings, and the private journal that would become the Red Book, suggest something closer to madness. He began to experience visions, waking dreams of a Europe flooded with blood, of seas turning to crimson, of cities in flames. He saw corpses floating in the water, and mountains crumbling, and a voice that told him catastrophe was coming. He thought, at first, that he was going insane. Then the First World War began, and he wondered if he'd been seeing the future. He started a practice that he called active imagination. He would sit alone in his study, quiet his mind, and allow images to arise from the unconscious. Then he would engage with them, speak to them, argue with them, paint them. Figures appeared. A dark-skinned man he called Car, a wise old man with wings and the horns of a bull he called Philemon, a seductive woman he called Salome. They had voices, they had opinions, they answered back. Philemon in particular became a kind of inner teacher. He told Jung things Jung did not know he knew. He represented, Jung came to believe, a form of consciousness that was autonomous, not a product of Jung's ego, but a genuine other, dwelling in the depths of the psyche. Was this madness? Was it mysticism? Was it a therapeutic technique or a breakdown dressed in respectable clothes? Jung himself was never entirely sure. He spent decades writing about these experiences, framing them, building a psychological system around them. But the uncertainty never quite went away. The man who taught the world to distinguish between the ego and the unconscious sometimes struggled to tell which voice was which. These are the depths from which Jungian psychology emerged. Not from the clinic alone, but from a journey that blurred every boundary Jung had ever known, between sanity and madness, between self and other, between the personal and the collective. He emerged from those years with the concepts that would define his work, the archetypes, which were universal patterns underlying the personal complexes, the collective unconscious, which was the shared psychic inheritance of humanity, deeper than any individual life, and the process of individuation, which was the lifelong journey toward wholeness, the integration of all the parts of the psyche, including the shadow, into a unified self. These ideas would change the world. They would influence art, literature, religion, psychotherapy. They would give countless people a language for experiences that had previously been nameless. But they emerged from a man in crisis, a man who had lost his mentor, lost his way, lost for a time his grip on what was real. And the question that haunts Jung's legacy is whether the wisdom he found in those depths was earned, whether he truly integrated his own shadow, or whether he simply built a more elaborate house to hide it in. The affair with Spielrein was not an anomaly. It was a pattern. Even as Jung descended into his confrontation with the unconscious, even as he painted Philemon and argued with Salome and emerged with a new psychology, there was another woman waiting in the wings, another former patient, another boundary about to be crossed. Her name was Toni Wolff, and her presence in Jung's life would last for 40 years. She came to him in 1910 when she was 22 years old and he was 35. She had been suffering from depression following the death of her father, a successful businessman who had left behind a family of women who did not quite know what to do with their grief. Toni Wolff was intelligent, intense, and searching for something she could not name. Jung was, at that point, still officially a disciple of Freud's, still building his practice, still working through the remnants of his entanglement with Sabine Spielrein. He took Wolff on as a patient. Within a few years, she had become something else entirely. The nature of their relationship is not in serious dispute. Jung's own family acknowledged it. His wife Emma acknowledged it. Toni Wolff became, in effect, the second woman in Jung's life, and she would remain there, openly, visibly, until her death in 1953. She attended family dinners at the house in Kusnacht. She accompanied Jung on professional trips. She collaborated with him intellectually, contributing ideas about the anima and the feminine that would shape his work. She was, by some accounts, the only person who could reach him during his darkest periods, the only one who understood the terrain of his inner visions well enough to guide him back. Emma Jung tolerated this. That is the word most biographers use, tolerated. She had married Carl at 21, borne him 5 children, managed his household, supported his career, and eventually became an analyst herself. She was, by all accounts, a woman of remarkable intelligence, and even more remarkable patience. And for more than 3 decades she shared her husband with another woman who sat at her table, who travelled with her family, who occupied a space in her marriage that had no name in the Switzerland of that era, or perhaps in any era. What did Emma feel? Her letters offer glimpses. There is a quality of grief in some of them, carefully contained, politely expressed. She wrote to Freud once, asking for advice about her husband's coldness, about how to reach him, about what was happening in her marriage. She studied analysis herself, eventually, in part to understand the man she had married, in part, perhaps, to find a language for what she was living through. She spent the last decades of her life working on a book about the Holy Grail, about the feminine in myth, about the wounds that do not heal. She never finished it. Toni Wolff, for her part, paid a different kind of price. She never married. She never had children. She gave her life to a man who gave her everything except legitimacy, who praised her intellect and relied on her insight and kept her, always, in the position of the other woman. When she died, Jung did not attend her funeral. He said he could not face it. The house in Kusnacht went on without her, and the family continued, and the work continued, and whatever Toni Wolff had hoped for, recognition, perhaps, or a place in history that was her own, did not quite arrive until scholars began, decades later, to piece together her contributions from the edges of his story. This was the household that produced Jungian psychology. This was the arrangement at its centre. A man who wrote about the integration of opposites, about the union of masculine and feminine, about the sacred marriage within the psyche, lived in a configuration that seemed to externalise that struggle rather than resolve it. He needed both women, he said. Emma was his anchor to the ordinary world, to hearth and home and the responsibilities of life. Toni was his connection to the depths, to the unconscious, to the realm of images and visions that fueled his work. Whether either woman would have chosen this arrangement, given any genuine choice, is a question the historical record does not quite answer. What it records is decades of accommodation, of triangulated pain, of a household that functioned because 2 women made it function, while the man at its centre theorised about wholeness. And then there are the shadows that reach beyond the personal, into the realm of history, into the darkness that settled over Europe in the 1930s, and Jung's navigation of it. This is where the biographical questions become harder, where the defences become more elaborate, and where the line between complexity and complicity grows difficult to trace. In 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. Within months, the process of Gleichschaltung, the Nazi term for coordination, for bringing all institutions under party control, had begun to reshape German professional life. Medical societies, psychological organisations, academic institutions, all were reorganised, their Jewish members expelled, their leadership replaced with party loyalists or those willing to work with the new regime. The General Medical Society for Psychotherapy was one such organisation. It had been an international body headquartered in Germany, with members across Europe. In 1933, under pressure from the Nazi state, it was restructured. Its German section was placed under party-aligned leadership. Its international wing needed a new president, someone with credibility outside Germany, someone who could give the reorganised society a veneer of respectability. They chose Carl Jung. He accepted. This is the fact around which all subsequent interpretation revolves. Jung became president of an international psychotherapy society that had been reshaped to accommodate National Socialist ideology. He held this position from 1933 to 1940, and in that capacity he made choices that his critics have never forgiven and his defenders have never fully explained. The Journal of the Society, the Zentralblatt for Psychotherapy, was edited by Jung during part of this period. In its pages in 1934, there appeared an editorial distinction between what the text called Aryan psychology and Jewish psychology. The Jewish unconscious, the editorial suggested, did not contain the same layers as the Germanic unconscious. It lacked certain depths. It was, in some unspecified way, different in kind. Jung would later claim that he had not written this particular passage, that it had been inserted by the German co-editor, that the complexities of joint editorship in a divided organisation made such incidents difficult to prevent. But the passage appeared under his name, in a journal he edited during years when every word about Jewish difference carried the weight of state violence behind it. And there were other passages, in other places, where the voice was unmistakably his own. In interviews from the mid-1930s, Jung spoke about the differences between Jewish and Aryan psychology with what can only be called enthusiasm. He suggested that Jews, as a people without land, without rootedness, had developed a psychology that was more intellectual, more abstract, less connected to the deep soil of the unconscious. He spoke of the Germanic psyche as having access to primordial depths that the Jewish psyche had lost or never possessed. He speculated about Wotan, the Old Norse god, awakening in the German soul, explaining the fervour of National Socialism as an eruption of archetypal forces. These were not marginal comments. They were published interviews, theoretical statements, serious attempts to apply Jungian concepts to the political upheaval of the era. And they read now as something between embarrassment and horror. Here was the man who had given the world the shadow, explaining the rise of fascism as a return of the repressed, a valid expression of collective psychology, while real people were being stripped of their citizenship, their property, their lives. What was Jung thinking? His defenders offer several explanations. He was trying, they say, to keep the international society alive, to preserve a space for non-Nazi psychotherapy in a Europe that was rapidly closing down. By remaining president, he could ensure that Jewish colleagues retained their membership in the international body even as they were expelled from national sections. He was playing a long game, navigating impossible circumstances, trying to salvage what could be salvaged, and there is some truth to this. Jung did intervene on behalf of individual Jewish colleagues. He did maintain the international membership provisions that allowed some to continue practicing under the Society's umbrella. He did eventually resign, in 1940, as the war made the contradictions of his position untenable. But the defence does not quite hold. It does not explain why he needed to articulate theories of racial psychology to maintain his position. It does not explain why his private letters from this period show less anguish about the Nazi regime than a man of his intelligence might have been expected to feel. It does not explain why, even after the war, even after the full horror had been revealed, his reckonings with this period remained partial, defensive, focused more on explaining himself than on confronting what he had enabled. There is a letter he wrote in 1934 to a Jewish colleague who had questioned his involvement with the reorganized society. In it, Jung defends himself vigorously. He insists that he is not an anti-Semite, that his statements about Jewish psychology are scientific observations, not political judgments. He suggests that his critic is being oversensitive, is failing to understand the nuances of his position. The letter has the tone of a man who believes he's being unfairly attacked, not a man wrestling with moral catastrophe. And the Wotan essay, published in 1936, remains one of the strangest documents in Jung's bibliography. In it, he treats the rise of National Socialism as a psychological event of world historical significance, an eruption of the old Germanic god of storm and frenzy into collective consciousness. He writes about Hitler's Germany the way an anthropologist might write about a tribal ritual, with fascinated distance, with interpretive interest, without moral horror. The essay is not pro-Nazi exactly, but it is not anti-Nazi either. It is something worse in a way. It is interested. It treats fascism as a phenomenon to be understood rather than resisted, an archetypal event rather than a political choice. Jung's psychology had always contained this tendency. The collective unconscious was, for him, a realm of forces that transcended individual morality, that operated beneath the level of conscious choice. Archetypes were neither good nor evil. They simply were. This framework gave him a way of talking about political horror that suspended judgment, that replaced ethics with phenomenology, and in the 1930s that suspension had consequences. It would be too simple to call Jung a Nazi collaborator. The evidence does not support that conclusion. He was not a party member. He did not endorse the regime's goals. He helped individual Jews when he could. By the late 1930s, his relations with Nazi-aligned colleagues had soured, and his resignation from the society in 1940 reflected genuine disillusionment. But it would also be too simple to call him an innocent bystander, a naive scientist caught up in forces he did not understand. Jung was one of the most psychologically sophisticated human beings of his century. He had built a system for understanding how people deceive themselves, how shadow and projection operate, how the things we refuse to see in ourselves get externalized onto others. And in the 1930s, he failed to apply that system to himself. He saw the Jewish other as psychologically different. He saw the Germanic soul as having unique depths. He saw fascism as archetypal eruption rather than moral catastrophe. And in all of this, he was projecting, doing exactly what he had warned his patients against, what he had built his entire psychology to prevent. The shadow he refused to see was the shadow of complicity, of flattery by the attention of powerful men, of the temptation to interpret rather than resist. His biographers still argue about how much weight to give this period. Some treat it as a relatively brief aberration, a misstep in a long and otherwise admirable career. Others see it as revealing something fundamental about Jung's character, about the dangers inherent in his psychological system, about what happens when you treat morality as merely another complex to be integrated rather than a standard to be upheld. The debate has no clean resolution. Jung lived another 2 decades after the war. He continued to write, to practice, to develop his ideas. He never recanted his work from the 30s, but he also never repeated it. He grew more interested in alchemy, in synchronicity, in the religious dimensions of the psyche. The political Jung receded, and the mystical Jung took his place. But the words on the page remain on the page, the interviews remain in the archives, and the question of what Jung knew, and when he knew it, and why he made the choices he made, continues to shadow the legacy he left behind. There is another shadow too, one that receives less attention in the popular accounts, but that modern scholars have increasingly brought to light. It concerns Jung's travels, his writings about non-European peoples, and the casual racial assumptions that pervade much of his anthropological work. In 1920, Jung travelled to North Africa. In 1924 and 1925, he visited the American Southwest, spending time with the Pueblo peoples of New Mexico. In 1925 and 1926, he undertook a longer journey to East Africa, to what was then British Kenya, hoping to encounter what he called the primitive mind in its natural setting. These trips were formative for him. He wrote about them extensively, treating them as encounters not just with other cultures, but with other layers of the human psyche. The African landscape, he said, awakened something in him, stirred memories that seemed older than his own life. The Pueblo elders, with their sun worship and their ceremonial dignity, gave him insights into the religious function of the psyche that European rationalism had obscured. He came back from these journeys transformed, convinced that he had touched something universal, something that his clinical work in Zurich could never have revealed. But the language he used to describe these encounters is difficult to read now. He wrote about the primitive mind as though it were a psychological stage, a level of consciousness that civilized Europeans had surpassed, but could still access in dreams and visions. He described African people as living in a kind of participation mystique, a state of undifferentiated consciousness in which the boundary between self and world had not yet fully formed. He treated the Pueblo ceremonies he witnessed as windows into the collective unconscious, as though the people performing them were expressions of archetypal forces rather than individuals with their own histories, their own intellects, their own interpretations of what they were doing. There is a passage in his memoir where he describes looking into the eyes of an African man and seeing something that disturbed him profoundly. He does not say, quite, what he saw, but the implication is that he saw the unconscious looking back, not a person, but a symbol. The man becomes, in Jung's telling, a screen onto which Jung projects his own theoretical preoccupations. The encounter is not a meeting of minds, but a confrontation with the depths, and the African serves as a kind of portal rather than a partner in the exchange. This was not unusual for a European intellectual of Jung's era. Anthropology in the early 20th century was saturated with such assumptions. The idea that non-European peoples represented earlier stages of human development, that their minds operated differently from civilized minds, that they could be studied the way one might study dreams or myths. This was mainstream science, respectable academic discourse. Jung was not more racist than his contemporaries. In some ways, he was less so. He genuinely admired the peoples he visited. He believed they had preserved something valuable that Europe had lost. He was not contemptuous, he was fascinated. But fascination of this kind has its own violence. To treat another person as an embodiment of the primitive, as a representative of an earlier stage of consciousness, is to deny them the complexity and individuality that you grant yourself. It is, in Jung's own terminology, a form of projection. The projection of the unconscious onto the other, the refusal to see the other as an other rather than a screen. And Jung, for all his insight into this mechanism, did not seem to recognize it in his own anthropological work. He wrote about the collective unconscious as though it were a universal inheritance, shared by all humanity. But the particular images he populated it with, the archetypes, the symbols, the mythological figures, were drawn overwhelmingly from European, Middle Eastern, and Asian sources. When he encountered African or indigenous American symbolism, he tended to interpret it through the lens of his existing framework, fitting it into categories that had already been established rather than allowing it to challenge or transform those categories. The result is a body of work that claims universality while remaining in many ways deeply parochial. The collective unconscious that Jung discovered turns out to look a great deal like the educated European unconscious, with its classical mythology and its Christian symbolism and its alchemical imagery. Other traditions appear in his work as examples, as data points, as confirmations of theories that were developed elsewhere. They rarely appear as sources of genuine new knowledge, as challenges to the framework itself. This is not to say that Jung's ideas have no value. They have immense value. The concepts of archetype and shadow and individuation have helped millions of people understand themselves. The therapeutic techniques he developed have alleviated genuine suffering. His insistence on the reality and significance of the inner world opened doors that had been closed by a too narrow rationalism. But the man who developed these concepts was a man of his time, with the blind spots of his time, and those blind spots are not incidental to his work. They are woven into its fabric. The shadow he wrote about so eloquently was in part his own shadow, projected outward onto women, onto Jews, onto the peoples of Africa and the Americas, onto everyone who could serve as a screen for the parts of himself he could not see. And perhaps this is the deepest irony of Jung's legacy. He gave the world a psychology of self-confrontation, a system designed to bring the hidden parts of the self into the light. He insisted that wholeness required shadow work, the painful acknowledgement of everything you had denied and repressed and projected onto others. He wrote about this with passion and conviction. He believed it. He taught it. He built an entire school of thought around it. But the evidence of his life suggests that he did not entirely do it. The affairs continued. The racial assumptions persisted. The defensive explanations for his Nazi-era activities never quite gave way to genuine reckoning. The stone tower he built by the lake, with its carved inscriptions and its carefully tended solitude, was perhaps less a confession than a fortress, a place where he could retreat from the judgments of the world, including the judgment he might have rendered on himself. His followers have struggled with this ever since. Some have chosen to separate the work from the man, to treat Jungian psychology as a system of ideas that can be evaluated on its own merits, independent of its creator's biography. Others have argued that the flaws in Jung's character reveal flaws in the system itself, blind spots built into the architecture of his thought. Still others have attempted a kind of Jungian analysis of Jung himself, treating his failures as examples of the very dynamics he described, evidence of how difficult the work of individuation truly is. None of these approaches is entirely satisfying. The man and the work are not so easily separated. The insights came from the life, and the life contained the contradictions. To understand Jungian psychology fully is to understand it as the product of a particular person, with particular wounds, particular privileges, particular blind spots. It is to hold two truths at once, that the ideas have power, and that the man who formulated them could not always live them. This is not a reason to reject Jung. It is a reason to read him carefully, critically, with the same attention to shadow and projection that he himself recommended. The master of the unconscious left clues, scattered throughout his biography, about the unconscious he could not master. And those clues are part of his legacy too, part of what he has to teach us, even if he did not intend to teach it. The house in Küsnacht still stands. It is a private residence now, not open to the public, maintained by the Jung family and the foundation that bears his name. Visitors to Zurich sometimes walk past it, glimpsing the garden where he once tended his thoughts, the study where he painted his visions, the dining room where Emma and Tony and the children gathered around a table laden with silence and accommodation. The stone tower at Bollingen is harder to reach. It sits on the upper shore of Lake Zurich, about 30 kilometres from the city, accessible only by private road. Jung built it over decades, adding rooms and inscriptions as his life unfolded, carving symbols into the stone with his own hands. He called it his confession in rock. He went there to be alone, to write, to think, to escape the obligations of his professional life. The tower has no electricity. He wanted it that way. He cooked over a fire, drew water from the lake, lived as simply as he could. It was a retreat from the modern world, a place where time moved differently, where the unconscious could rise to the surface without the distractions of civilization. He died in 1961, at 85 years old, in the house in Küsnacht. His funeral was private. His grave, in the local Protestant cemetery, bears a Latin inscription that he chose himself. Vocatus atque non vocatus, Deus aderit. Called or not called, the God will be present. It was a phrase he had found in Erasmus, an invocation of forces larger than the individual will. He had carved it over the door of his house too. It was his answer, perhaps, to the question of what all the visions and figures and descents into the unconscious had finally meant. Whether he had found wholeness or merely chased it. Whether the gods he encountered were real or imagined or something stranger than either. The words remain there still, carved in stone, as the lake laps at the shore and the Alps rise in the distance, as quiet and patient and ambiguous as everything else he left behind. The question of what Jung left behind is not a simple one. A body of work, yes, a vocabulary that has seeped into the groundwater of modern thought, but also something more elusive, something that resists the kind of clean summary a biography might offer. He left behind a way of thinking about the human mind that is at once illuminating and deeply strange, a system of ideas that has helped millions of people understand themselves and that has also been used to justify some profoundly questionable conclusions. He left behind a community of followers, some of whom treat his writings with the reverence usually reserved for scripture, and some of whom have spent decades trying to disentangle the insights from the blind spots. And he left behind a set of questions that he himself never fully answered, questions that still hang in the air over Küsnacht, over Bollingen, over the entire field of depth psychology. Perhaps the most important of these questions is also the simplest. Does it work? Does the Jungian framework actually help people understand themselves, heal themselves, become more whole? This is not a question that can be answered in the abstract. It depends on who is asking, on what they bring to the encounter, on whether they find in Jung's language a map that matches their inner territory. For some people, the discovery of Jungian psychology has been transformative, a key that unlocks doors they did not even know were there. For others, it has been a frustrating detour, a set of concepts that sound profound, but do not quite connect to lived experience. And for still others, it has been actively harmful, a framework that encourages rumination and introspection at the expense of practical change, or that provides intellectual cover for avoiding the hard work of confronting one's actual behaviour in the actual world. The evidence, such as it is mixed. Unlike cognitive behavioural therapy or other approaches that lend themselves to controlled studies, Jungian analysis is difficult to test empirically. It unfolds over years, often decades. Its goals are not always clearly defined. It deals in experiences that resist measurement, in shifts of meaning and felt sense rather than observable behaviour. Practitioners would say that this is precisely the point, that the psyche cannot be reduced to data, that healing happens in dimensions that science has not yet learned to see. Critics would say that this is a convenient excuse, that any system of ideas that cannot be tested cannot be trusted, that the apparent profundity of Jungian thought may be nothing more than a sophisticated form of pattern matching, finding meaning where there is only randomness. The honest answer is probably somewhere in between. Jungian psychology offers a rich symbolic vocabulary, for making sense of inner experience. For people who respond to that kind of language, who find that their dreams and fantasies and moods become more comprehensible when viewed through the lens of archetypes and complexes and the individuation journey, the framework can be genuinely useful. It provides a way of thinking about the self that takes the full range of human experience seriously, including experiences that other psychological systems tend to dismiss or pathologize. The encounter with the shadow, the integration of the anima or animus, the dialogue with figures from the unconscious. These are not concepts that can be proven or disproven in a laboratory, but they describe something that many people recognize, something that feels true to the texture of their own inner lives. At the same time, the Jungian framework has its dangers. It can encourage a kind of narcissistic self-absorption, an endless fascination with one's own depths that never quite translates into engagement with the outer world. It can provide a language for rationalizing almost anything, for treating every impulse as a message from the unconscious, every flaw as a necessary stage in the individuation process. It can foster a sense of specialness, of being on a journey that ordinary people do not understand, that can isolate as much as it illuminates. And it can be used, as Jung himself sometimes used it, to avoid accountability, to treat one's own harmful behaviour as merely the expression of archetypal forces rather than something for which one is personally responsible. These are the tensions that anyone who takes Jung seriously must eventually confront. The ideas are powerful, they illuminate, but they also distort. They reveal and they conceal. They can be tools for self-knowledge and tools for self-deception, sometimes at the same time. To read Jung well is to read with this awareness, to hold the insights and the blind spots together, to use the framework without being used by it. This is, ironically, what Jung himself would have recommended. He distrusted followers who swallowed his ideas whole. He wanted people to find their own way, to use his concepts as maps rather than territories, to remember that the unconscious is always more than any system can contain. Whether he managed to do this himself is another question. The evidence suggests that he struggled, as everyone struggles, with the gap between theory and practice, between knowing and being. The influence of his ideas, meanwhile, has spread far beyond the consulting room. When a filmmaker speaks of the hero's journey, they are drawing on concepts that Jung articulated, even if they have never read a word of his writing. When a novelist creates a character who must confront their dark double, they are working with a pattern that Jung named and explored. When a therapist asks a client what a dream might be trying to say, rather than what it might mean according to some fixed code, they are operating in a space that Jung helped to open. The vocabulary of archetypes and shadows and complexes has become part of the common inheritance of Western culture, used by people who have no idea where the words came from, absorbed into the background assumptions of how we think about minds and stories and selves. This influence has not always been benign. The concept of archetypes, in particular, has been used to justify all manner of questionable claims about the innate differences between groups of people, about what men and women are naturally like, about what certain cultures or races supposedly express. Jung himself, as we have seen, was not innocent of such uses, and his followers have not always been careful to distinguish between the archetypal patterns that genuinely seem to recur across human experience and the particular cultural assumptions that happen to be embedded in Jung's own historical moment. The collective unconscious, as a concept, is slippery. It can mean that there are deep structures of the human mind that manifest across cultures, which is a reasonable, if debatable, hypothesis. Or it can mean that certain specific images and stories are universal, which is much harder to defend. Or it can mean that the symbols and narratives of one's own culture are more fundamental than others, which is where the concept shades into something more troubling. Jung was not always clear about which version he meant, and his readers have not always been careful about which version they are using. The same could be said of the shadow. As a concept, it points to something real and important, the way that we all carry aspects of ourselves that we have denied or repressed, that we project onto others, that influence our behaviour in ways we do not recognise. This is not a controversial claim. Virtually every school of psychology acknowledges something like it, even if they use different language. What Jung added was a particular way of working with the shadow, a set of practices for bringing it into consciousness, for integrating rather than merely suppressing what we would rather not see. This has been genuinely helpful for many people. The encounter with one's own capacity for cruelty, for selfishness, for destruction, can be profoundly liberating. It can free a person from the exhausting work of maintaining a false image of goodness, from the constant vigilance required to keep the unwanted parts of the self out of awareness. It can make room for a more honest and more compassionate relationship with oneself and others. But the shadow concept has also been misused. It has been invoked to excuse harmful behaviour, to suggest that acting on dark impulses is a form of authenticity, to treat every cruel or destructive act as merely the emergence of something that needed to emerge. This is a distortion of what Jung actually taught, but it is a distortion that his writings sometimes enable. The line between integrating the shadow and indulging it is not always clear, and Jung himself did not always respect it. His relationships with his patients, his accommodation with National Socialism, his willingness to rationalize his own behavior in terms of archetypal necessity, all of these can be read as failures of shadow integration, moments when he used his own concepts to avoid rather than confront what was actually happening. The theory describes the trap. The theorist fell into it anyway. This is the paradox at the heart of Jung's legacy. He understood something profound about the human tendency to avoid self-knowledge, to project onto others what we cannot tolerate in ourselves, to construct elaborate defences against the truths we most need to hear. And yet he himself was not immune to these tendencies. He was human, in other words, brilliant, insightful, creative, and also blind in the particular ways that his brilliance and insight and creativity allowed him to be blind. This does not invalidate his ideas. It does not mean that the framework is worthless, or that his writings should be discarded. But it does mean that the framework must be used with caution, with awareness of its limitations, with the recognition that no system of thought, however profound, can protect us from our own unconscious. The tools can help. They cannot do the work for us. And they can, if we're not careful, become another way of avoiding the work altogether. The field that Jung helped to found has continued to evolve since his death. Analytical psychology, as it is formally known, remains a living tradition, with training institutes and professional organisations around the world. But it has also changed, sometimes in ways that Jung himself might not have recognised. Contemporary Jungian analysts tend to be more aware of the cultural biases embedded in the original formulations, more careful about claims of universality, more attentive to the ways that power and privilege shape the therapeutic relationship. Some have integrated insights from other schools of thought, from attachment theory to neuroscience to feminist critiques of psychoanalysis. Others have pushed back against what they see as a dilution of Jung's original vision, arguing that the archetypes and the collective unconscious must be taken seriously as realities, not merely as metaphors or cultural artifacts. The debates are ongoing. They are, in their way, a continuation of the debates that Jung himself engaged in throughout his life, about the nature of the psyche, the reality of the inner world, the relationship between individual and collective. One strand of contemporary Jungian thought has focused on what might be called the cultural unconscious, the layer of assumptions and images that are shared within a particular society, but not necessarily across all human cultures. This is a useful corrective to the more grandiose claims about universal archetypes. It suggests that much of what Jung identified as the collective unconscious might be better understood as the sediment of specific historical traditions, European, Christian, classical, transmitted through education and literature and art rather than encoded in the structure of the human brain. This does not make the images less powerful. It does make them less universal. And it opens the door to a more pluralistic understanding of depth psychology, one that can take seriously the symbolic worlds of cultures that Jung himself approached with condescension or curiosity, but rarely with genuine respect. Another strand has focused on the embodied nature of psychological experience, the way that the archetypes and complexes are not merely mental phenomena but are felt in the body, expressed in gesture and posture and sensation. This is actually closer to what Jung himself sometimes wrote, particularly in his later work, but it has been developed more fully by contemporary practitioners who draw on somatic therapies and phenomenological approaches. The shadow, in this view, is not just an idea to be understood, but an experience to be felt, a tension in the shoulders, a tightness in the chest, a particular quality of breath when we encounter something we have been denying. The integration of the shadow is not just an intellectual achievement, but a bodily one, a shift in how we inhabit ourselves, relaxation of the constant muscular effort required to hold the unwanted parts at bay. Still another strand has emphasized the relational dimensions of Jungian work, the way that the unconscious is not only encountered through dreams and fantasies, but through the dynamics that unfold between analyst and patient, or between any two people in intimate relationship. This has led to a richer understanding of transference and countertransference, of the way that what is unconscious in one person can be lived out in the relationship with another, of how healing happens not just through insight, but through the experience of being seen and held by someone who can tolerate what we cannot yet tolerate in ourselves. Jung knew this, of course. His own most intense psychological experiences often unfolded in relationship with Freud, with Spielrein, with Tony Wolff. But the relational dimension was not always at the centre of his theoretical formulations, and contemporary Jungians have done much to bring it forward. The influence extends beyond the clinical. In the humanities, in religious studies, in the study of mythology and folklore, Jung's ideas continue to provide a framework for understanding the patterns that recur across human storytelling. Joseph Campbell, whose work on the hero's journey became enormously influential in its own right, was deeply indebted to Jung, even as he developed the ideas in directions that Jung might not have anticipated. The notion that there are fundamental narrative structures that underlie all human mythology, that the hero's descent into the underworld and return with a boon, is a pattern that speaks to something deep in the human psyche. This is a Jungian idea, even when it's presented without explicit reference to Jung. It has shaped how screenwriters think about story structure, how game designers think about quest narratives, how therapists think about the shape of a life. Whether it is true in the strong sense, whether these patterns are actually built into the architecture of the human mind, remains an open question. But the framework has been enormously generative, regardless of its ultimate truth value. In the realm of spirituality, Jung's influence has been perhaps even more pervasive. He provided a language for people who wanted to take their inner experiences seriously without committing to the doctrines of any particular religious tradition. The encounter with the numinous, the confrontation with figures that feel autonomous and powerful and larger than the individual ego, the sense that the psyche contains depths that touch something beyond the merely personal, all of these could be understood in Jungian terms as psychological realities, as experiences of the objective psyche, rather than encounters with transcendent beings. This allowed many people to have a spiritual life without believing in supernatural entities, to treat their dreams and visions and synchronicities as meaningful without having to decide whether they came from God or merely from their own unconscious. It was a compromise in a way of having the experience without the metaphysics. Some found it liberating, others found it ultimately unsatisfying, a halfway house that avoided the hard questions about what these experiences actually are and what they actually mean. Jung himself never quite resolved these questions. He insisted, until the end of his life, that he was an empiricist, a scientist of the soul, not a metaphysician. He claimed to be describing what he observed, not making claims about ultimate reality. And yet his writings are full of passages that seem to go beyond mere description, that seem to be making claims about the nature of the cosmos, about the relationship between mind and matter, about the reality of the archetypes as something more than psychological constructs. The tension is never fully resolved. It is part of what makes his work both fascinating and frustrating, depending on what you're looking for. Those who want clear answers will not find them. Those who are comfortable with ambiguity, with holding multiple possibilities at once, with living in the question rather than demanding the answer, will find a rich and strange companion. The house in Küsnacht stands quiet in the Swiss twilight, its windows reflecting the last light off the lake. The tower at Bollingen keeps its own counsel, stone upon stone, the inscriptions weathering slowly, the fire pit cold. The books remain on the shelves, translated into dozens of languages, read by people who will never see these places, who will never walk the paths that Jung walked, who will encounter his ideas in their own contexts, in their own struggles, filtered through their own wounds and longings and blind spots. Some will find what they need, others will find only confusion, or worse, a framework that confirms their prejudices, that gives them permission to avoid what they most need to face. The ideas are tools. They can be used well or badly. They can illuminate or obscure. They cannot by themselves make anyone whole. What remains, after all the biography and all the critique and all the influence traced and catalogued, is the original intuition. There is more to you than you know. The parts of yourself that you have exiled are still there, still active, still shaping your life from the darkness. To become who you are truly and fully requires a descent, a confrontation, an integration. The shadow must be faced. The figures from the deep must be heard. The work is hard and it is never finished, and no one can do it for you, and there are no guarantees. But it is the only work worth doing if you want to be more than a fragment of yourself, if you want to stop projecting onto the world what belongs inside you, if you want to live rather than merely exist. This was Jung's message, however imperfectly he embodied it. This is what draws people to his work, generation after generation, despite the flaws and the contradictions and the passages that make a contemporary reader wince. Something in the framework speaks to something in the human condition, to the sense that we are larger and stranger and more mysterious than we usually allow ourselves to believe. Whether this sense is an illusion or an insight, whether the unconscious is a place or a metaphor or something stranger than either, whether Jung was a sage or a charlatan or merely a brilliant and damaged man trying to make sense of his own depths, these are questions that each reader must ultimately answer for themselves. The invitation stands, the door is open, what lies beyond it cannot be told, only discovered, and in the end that is perhaps the most Jungian thing of all. The lake at Zurich holds its memories like sediment, layer upon layer, the surface betraying nothing of what lies beneath. And beneath Jung's public life, beneath the theories and the terminology, and the consulting room where so many souls poured out their dreams, there was always another layer, another depth, another thing that the man who invented the shadow preferred not to examine too closely in himself. We have to go back now, to the beginning of all this, to understand how the cracks formed and what grew in them. Carl Jung was born in 1875 in Kesswil, a small village on the Swiss shore of Lake Constance, into a family that was already fractured in ways that would echo through his entire life. His father, Johann Paul Achilles Jung, was a pastor in the Swiss Reformed Church, a man who had once been passionate about his faith and had somehow lost it, continuing to preach from pulpits words he no longer believed. Carl would later write that his father's faith was hollow, that the man performed the rituals without feeling them, that something essential had died in him long before his body followed. This observation, made by a son about a father, carries the particular cruelty that only children can inflict on parents, and also, perhaps, a particular truth. His mother, Emilie Preisberg, came from a family steeped in what we might now call the paranormal, though they would not have used that word. Her relatives claimed visions, heard voices, conducted seances. She herself was prone to episodes that the family called her other personality, a voice that would emerge in the night, speaking in strange tones about things that the daytime Emily claimed not to remember. Young Carl, sleeping in a room adjacent to his parents, heard these nocturnal emanations. He grew up in a house where the boundary between the ordinary world and something else was thin, perhaps too thin, and where no one seemed able or willing to make it solid. When he was 3 years old, his mother was hospitalized for several months. The official reason has been lost to family discretion, but the effect on the child was profound. He would later write that it left him with a lasting distrust of the word love, that whenever he heard it he felt suspicious, that something in him had learned too early that people who are supposed to stay can suddenly vanish. He developed what he called a nervous illness of his own, eczema that covered his body, a sensitivity that the household servants struggled to manage in his mother's absence. The house was dark, the father was defeated, the mother was unreliable, and the child found solace where children often do. In the interior world, in fantasy, in secret rituals that no one else knew about. He carved a small figure from a wooden ruler, placed it in a pencil case, along with a painted stone, and hid it in the forbidden attic of the house. He would visit this figure, this private god, in moments of distress, bringing it tiny scrolls written in a language he invented. The ritual soothed him. It was his first experience of what he would later call a symbol that lived, an object that held meaning beyond its material form, a practice that worked even though he could not explain why. This is the seed of everything that came after. A lonely boy in a dark house, with a broken father and a disappearing mother, finding that the inner world could offer what the outer world withheld. The question that would occupy his entire career, the question of what the unconscious is and how to work with it, began here, in childhood, in the discovery that something inside him was wiser, or at least more creative than his conscious mind, and that it could be reached through images and rituals and dreams. He was also from very early acquainted with the shadow. There was, he would later confess, another personality in him, something he called number 2, a figure that felt old and wise and slightly frightening, who seemed to know things that little Carl did not know, who existed alongside his ordinary self like a guest who would not leave. Number 1 was the schoolboy, the son, the child who played games and did chores. Number 2 was ancient, connected to the 18th century for reasons Carl never fully understood. Solemn, knowing, slightly monstrous. He did not know then what to make of this doubled consciousness. He only knew that it was his, and that he could not speak of it to anyone. This is a detail that biographers have puzzled over for decades. Was this simply the imaginative play of a bright and lonely child, the kind of internal narrative that many children develop and later forget? Or was it something more, an early manifestation of the dissociative tendencies that would later take him to the edge of what he himself feared was madness? The answer may be both. The inner world that sustained him was also the inner world that threatened him. The gift and the wound were the same. He grew, as children do. He went to school in Basel, a city of greater culture and stimulation than the village of his birth. He struggled in mathematics and flourished in the humanities. He was physically large, often fighting, not well liked by his peers. He was also, by his own account, subject to fainting spells that came on whenever he faced something he did not want to do. The spells began when he was struck on the head by a classmate, and discovered, perhaps not entirely consciously, that falling down meant not having to face the school day. They ended when he overheard his father speaking to a visitor about the boy's uncertain future, about the fear that Carl might never be able to support himself. The fainting stopped that day. He decided, he would later write, that he would have to take responsibility for his own life. It was his first conscious victory over his own unconscious mechanisms, though he would not have used those words yet. Medicine called to him, partly because science seemed like a way to make sense of the confusion, partly because his family had no money and a medical career offered stability. But within medicine, he was drawn almost immediately to the branch that other doctors avoided and disdained: psychiatry, the study of the mad, the work that happened in asylums where polite society preferred not to look. He later said that when he read the preface to a psychiatric textbook, Krafft Ebing's description of the psychoses as diseases of the personality, something clicked into place. Here was a field that dealt with what actually mattered, the question of who we are and what goes wrong with us, and whether anything can be done about it. Here was where his two worlds, the scientific and the mysterious, might actually meet. He went to work at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich in 1900, under the direction of Eugen Bleuler, who would later coin the term schizophrenia. The Burghölzli was one of the most advanced psychiatric institutions of its time, which is to say it was a place where the mad were treated with marginally less cruelty than elsewhere, where doctors actually attempted to understand what their patients were experiencing rather than simply confining them. Jung threw himself into the work. He lived on the hospital grounds. He listened to patients whom other doctors had given up on, spending hours with them, taking their delusions seriously as communications rather than dismissing them as mere symptoms. And it was here, in this crucible, that he met Sabine Spielrein. She arrived at the Burghölzli in August of 1904, 18 years old, transported from Russia in a state of severe disturbance. The admissions records describe fits of laughing and crying, sticking out her tongue, grimacing, an inability to look anyone in the face. She had been a brilliant student, gifted in languages and science, and something had broken in her. The diagnosis was hysteria, the catch-all term of the era for disturbances that seemed to have no physical cause, that were written on the body but originated somewhere in the mind. Jung, then 29, was assigned to her case. He saw her frequently, sometimes daily. He experimented with a technique that was still relatively new, adapted from Freud's work in Vienna, the practice of free association, of following the patient's words wherever they led, of listening for the hidden logic beneath the apparent chaos. He developed his own variation, the word association test, measuring response times and emotional reactions to stimulus words, building an empirical method for detecting what he called complexes, the emotionally charged clusters of ideas and memories that distorted conscious thought. Sabina responded. She improved. She emerged from her acute state and began, eventually, to pursue her own studies, entering the medical faculty at the University of Zurich, one of the few universities in Europe that admitted women at the time. She was brilliant, articulate, passionate about the new science of the mind that had helped her, and somewhere in this process the boundaries dissolved. We do not know exactly when the relationship became sexual, or even with certainty that it did. Jung was married by then to Emma Rauschenbach, a wealthy young woman who had brought him financial security and who loved him deeply. He would always deny, publicly, that the affair with Sabina had been fully consummated. But his letters, and hers, tell a different story, or at least suggest one. They tell of passion and torment, of a love that could not be acknowledged, of fantasies they shared about a child they would create together, a heroic child, a Siegfried who would embody the best of both of them. They tell of a young woman who believed she had found her destiny, and a young man who could not decide what he wanted. The situation was, by any standard, a profound violation. Sabina had come to him as a patient, disturbed, vulnerable, trusting. He was her doctor. The power differential was absolute. Whatever tender feelings may have developed, whatever mutual recognition of souls they may have believed they shared, the structure was corrupt from the start. This is not a judgment that requires modern sensibilities. Even by the ethical standards of the early 20th century, even by the standards of the nascent psychoanalytic movement that was still groping toward professional norms, what Jung did was wrong. He knew it was wrong. That is why he hid it. When rumours began to circulate, when Sabina's mother wrote to him demanding to know what was happening with her daughter, Jung responded with a letter that historians still wince to read. He blamed Sabina. He implied that she was a difficult patient who had become obsessed with him, that she was spreading false rumours to damage him, that he was the victim in this situation. He asked her mother to help him break off contact. The letter survives. It is not the letter of a man who has nothing to hide. Sabina kept her own records, her own diaries, her own account of what had happened between them. These documents came to light only decades after her death, and they tell a story of a young woman who had been profoundly shaped by the encounter, who had loved Jung and been wounded by him, who had eventually found the strength to pull away and build her own life and career, but who never entirely recovered from the original betrayal. She would go on to become one of the first female psychoanalysts, to write influential papers on destruction and transformation, to train other analysts, to return eventually to Russia, where she continued her work until the Second World War came and took everything. She died in 1942, during the German occupation, shot along with her two daughters in a synagogue in Rostov-on-Don, where Jews had been herded for execution. Her story is often told as a footnote to Jung's. It should not be. She was a person in her own right, a thinker in her own right, a casualty not only of war but of a system that allowed men like Jung to use women like her and then rewrite the history. But she is also, inescapably, part of Jung's story, part of what he carried, and part of what he refused to fully face. He spoke of her in later years with something approaching tenderness, acknowledging his debt to her, admitting that she had taught him things. He never, as far as we know, fully acknowledged the harm, and she was not alone. The pattern repeated as patterns do. After Sabina, or perhaps overlapping with her, there was Tony Wolff, another patient who became a lover, but this time the arrangement took a different form. Tony did not disappear from Jung's life. She stayed for decades as his acknowledged partner, his intellectual collaborator, his muse. Emma Jung, his wife, tolerated this, or at least endured it. The three of them found some kind of equilibrium, with Tony joining the family for meals, accompanying Jung on travels, becoming essential to his work in ways that Emma apparently could not be. Jung defended this arrangement in terms that sound, depending on one's perspective, either brutally honest or self-servingly convenient. He believed, or claimed to believe, that he had more than one soul, that the monogamous bourgeois arrangement was too small for the complexity of his psyche, that Tony represented something that Emma could not, that both relationships were necessary. He had theories to support this, theories about the anima and the different forms it could take, theories that could make almost any behaviour seem like a requirement of psychological growth. The women paid the price. Emma lived her entire adult life in a marriage that was never entirely hers. Tony, who never married, who had no children, who gave her life to a man she could never fully have, spent her final years increasingly isolated, struggling with illness, dying in 1953 in what some accounts suggest was deep despair. She had been essential. She had been kept on the margins. She had been used, however lovingly the using was described, and the pattern extended beyond these two. There were other patients, other students, other women who entered Jung's orbit and found themselves in ambiguous territory where therapeutic care and personal desire blurred, where the doctor's authority sanctioned the doctor's appetites. The full extent is not known, may never be known. What is known is that Jung's theory and Jung's life were intertwined in ways that are not always flattering, that the great cartographer of the shadow had his own territories of darkness that he preferred not to map. This matters because the theory claims to be universal. Individuation, the journey toward wholeness, the integration of the shadow, these are supposed to be requirements for everyone. The analyst is supposed to have walked the path before guiding others. Jung made enormous demands of his patients, pushing them to confront painful truths, to face the parts of themselves they wanted to deny. The question hangs in the air. Did he make the same demands of himself? Did he face his own shadow, really face it? Or did he construct a theory that allowed him to reframe his failures as necessities, his transgressions as requirements of a larger soul? The answer probably is both. Jung was not a simple hypocrite. He struggled genuinely with his own darkness. The descent that followed his break with Freud, the years of what he called confrontation with the unconscious, was not a pose. He was terrified. He thought he was losing his mind. He saw figures, heard voices, experienced states that he could not control. The Red Book, his private record of that period, is the testimony of a man grappling with forces that threaten to overwhelm him. It is not the record of someone taking the easy path, but struggle is not the same as resolution. A man can wrestle with his shadow and still lose. A man can name his demons and still fail to exorcise them. The categories that Jung created, shadow and anima and persona and self, are powerful tools for seeing the structure of the psyche, but having the map does not mean completing the journey. Jung knew more about the unconscious than perhaps anyone of his era. That does not mean he mastered his own. What we see, looking back from this distance, is a picture more complicated than either hagiography or condemnation. There was genuine insight. There was genuine courage. There was also harm, inflicted on people who trusted him, justified with theories that conveniently exempted the theorist from ordinary moral accountability. The two things exist together. The truth is not one or the other, but both. And perhaps that too is Jungian in its way. Perhaps the shadow is never fully integrated, only met again and again in new forms throughout a life. Perhaps the journey toward wholeness is not a destination but a direction, and even those who travel furthest still carry their darkness with them. Perhaps the man who told the world that the shadow must be faced was also telling himself, and the telling was not the same as the doing, and he knew it, and went on anyway, because there was nothing else to do. The lake at Kusnacht holds its memories, the tower at Bollingen keeps its secrets, and somewhere in the archive, in letters and diaries and documents that are still being catalogued and translated and interpreted, the full story waits, patient as sediment, for those who are willing to look. The willingness to look is itself a kind of courage. It is also, as Jung understood better than most, a kind of burden. Because once you begin to see, you cannot choose to unsee. The patterns emerge, the contradictions sharpen, and the comfortable distance between the observer and the observed begins to collapse. This is what happens when we turn our attention to the broader question that Jung's life and work inevitably raises, the question of what it means to build a system of healing on a foundation that was never entirely stable, the question of whether a flawed messenger can carry a true message, the question of what we do with the teachings of those whose lives did not match their words. It is a very old question. Every spiritual tradition, every philosophical school, every discipline that concerns itself with human transformation has had to reckon with it. The teacher who preaches compassion and treats his students cruelly, the monk who advocates simplicity and accumulates wealth, the healer whose own wounds never close. We want our guides to be better than us. We want the path they describe to have already worked for them. And when we discover that it has not, that the path was perhaps as much aspiration as achievement, something in us recoils. Jung was aware of this problem. He wrote about it. He warned his students that the analyst's own analysis was never finished, that the shadow returned in new forms throughout a life, that wholeness was not a state to be achieved but a process to be continued. He built, in other words, a certain amount of immunity into his system. The theory accounts for the theorist's failures. The map includes a notation that the mapmaker may be lost. But this is also, if we are being honest, a kind of escape hatch. A theory that explains away its creator's shortcomings is a theory that cannot be falsified by those shortcomings. If Jung's infidelities are reframed as necessities of individuation, if his coldness toward his children is understood as the inevitable cost of genius, if his moral lapses are absorbed into a larger narrative of psychological complexity, then the theory becomes unfalsifiable in precisely the domain where falsification matters most. We cannot point to Jung's life and say the theory does not work, because the theory has already anticipated our objection. The shadow, it tells us, is never fully integrated. Even the master struggles. This is how it is supposed to go. The circularity is troubling. It does not mean the theory is wrong. It means the theory cannot be tested by the life of the man who created it. And this returns us to the only ground where testing is possible, our own experience. Does the concept of the shadow help us understand ourselves? Does the process of confronting what we would rather deny make us more whole, more capable of living with integrity, more able to love and work and bear the weight of being human? These questions cannot be answered by studying Jung. They can only be answered by studying ourselves. And yet the study of Jung is not irrelevant to the answers, because what we learn from his life is something valuable, even if it is not what he intended to teach. We learn that the work is harder than it looks. We learn that insight is not transformation. We learn that a man can see his shadow clearly, describe it in precise and beautiful language, and still be governed by it. We learn, in other words, that the distance between knowing and doing is vast, and that the crossing of that distance is the real work, and that the work is never finished. This is perhaps the most useful thing Jung's biography offers us. Not a model to emulate, but a warning to heed. The map is not the territory. The word is not the thing. Understanding the concept of the shadow is the beginning, not the end. The end, if there is one, comes only through the slow, painful, unglamorous process of living differently, not just thinking differently. And that process requires something that no theory can provide: moral will. The simple, brutal commitment to doing what you know to be right, even when it is difficult, even when it costs you something, even when the voice of rationalization whispers that you are an exception, that your circumstances are unique, that the rules do not apply to someone of your depth and complexity. Jung had enormous intellectual will. He could think more deeply and more originally than almost anyone of his time. What he lacked, or what he possessed in insufficient measure, was the moral will to apply his insights to his own behaviour consistently. He knew what wholeness required. He did not always do it. And the knowing without the doing is perhaps the deepest form of the shadow, the darkest corner of the unlived life, to see the path clearly and to walk another way. But we should be careful here. The temptation, when examining a figure like Jung, is to stand in judgment, to adopt the posture of moral superiority that comes so easily when we examine the failures of the dead. This temptation should be resisted, not because Jung's failures do not matter, but because the failures of others are always easier to see than our own, and the very act of judgment can become a way of avoiding the harder work of self-examination. Jung's shadow is not our business, finally. Our shadow is our business. And the most dangerous thing we can do with Jung's story is use it as a distraction from our own. Still, there are lessons, and the lessons become clearer when we consider not just Jung the individual, but the broader phenomenon that grew from his work, the schools and institutes, the training programs and certification processes, the lineages of analysts and patients and analysans that have carried his ideas forward into the present, because the question of the flawed founder becomes even more acute when the founder's flaws are replicated, institutionalized, and passed on. The history of the Jungian movement is not without its own shadows. The charismatic teacher who exploits students, the training analysis that becomes a vehicle for dependency, the closed systems of thought that resist criticism from outside. These are not unique to Jungian psychology. They appear in every tradition that involves the transmission of wisdom from one person to another. But they are present in the Jungian world, and they are worth acknowledging because they raise the uncomfortable possibility that something in the structure of the work itself may predispose it to certain kinds of failure. The analyst-patient relationship is inherently asymmetrical. One person is seeking help, the other is offering it. One person is vulnerable, the other is empowered. This asymmetry is necessary. It is how healing happens. But it is also dangerous, because power tends to corrupt, and the kind of power that comes from being trusted with someone's deepest secrets and most painful wounds is particularly intoxicating. The analyst who believes himself to be wise, who has been trained in a tradition that valorizes depth and complexity, who has a theory that explains and justifies almost any behaviour, is at risk of a particular kind of blindness. He may come to believe that his insights exempt him from ordinary moral constraints. He may confuse his position of authority with actual superiority. He may exploit his patients without recognising what he is doing, because the theory provides such convenient explanations for what is really happening. Jung's relationships with Spielrein and Wolff established a template. The brilliant, wounded woman who enters the analyst's life, who is healed by his attention, who then becomes his partner or lover or muse or colleague, who is both elevated and diminished by the relationship, who serves his needs while believing herself to be serving the work. This pattern recurred throughout Jung's life. It has recurred throughout the history of his movement, and the question we must ask is whether the pattern is incidental, a matter of one man's weakness that has unfortunately been imitated, or whether it is somehow structural, built into the fabric of the enterprise. The answer is probably both. The asymmetry of the therapeutic relationship creates opportunity for exploitation. The valorization of the unconscious, with its amoral forces and archaic images, can become a justification for acting on impulses that should be resisted. The emphasis on the integration of opposites can be twisted into a rationale for moral relativism, the idea that what seems wrong from one perspective may be right from another, deeper one. These are not necessary consequences of Jung's ideas, but they are possible consequences, and the history suggests that the possibilities have sometimes been realized. None of this means that Jungian psychology is worthless, or that its insights are invalid, or that the hundreds of thousands of people who have been helped by analysts working in this tradition have been deceived. The tools are real. The map has value. The concepts illuminate corners of the human psyche that had been dark before. What it means is that the tools must be used carefully, that the map must be held lightly, that the tradition must be subjected to ongoing criticism and correction, and that the figure of the founder must be seen clearly, shadows and all, so that his mistakes are not mindlessly repeated. This is what mature traditions do. They revere their founders without worshipping them. They preserve the insights while acknowledging the limitations. They allow the legacy to grow and change, shedding what no longer serves, adding what the founder could not see. Christianity did this with Paul. Buddhism did this with some of its patriarchs. Science does this constantly, building on the work of predecessors while correcting their errors. A tradition that cannot do this, that treats its founder as beyond criticism, becomes a cult. A tradition that does this well becomes something living, something that can continue to offer wisdom long after the founder's personal failures have been forgotten. Jungian psychology is in the process of doing this, slowly and imperfectly. The archives are being opened. The biographies are becoming more honest. The training programs are grappling, some of them, with questions of power and ethics that were not addressed when the movement was young. The shadow of the founder is being brought into the light, not to destroy the legacy, but to deepen it, to show that the work of integration is never complete and must be undertaken by every generation anew. And the work goes on in individual lives, in the quiet struggles of people who have never heard of Jung, but who are nonetheless engaged in the same project he described. The attempt to become whole, to face what is painful, to live with more integrity than would be comfortable. A woman in Sao Paulo sits with her memories of a childhood she has never discussed. A man in Toronto begins to notice the patterns in his relationships, the way he chooses partners who will hurt him, the way he becomes someone he does not recognize when he is afraid. A teenager in Nairobi writes in a journal, trying to understand why she's drawn to the things that frighten her, why the darkness in stories speaks to something she cannot name. None of them would describe what they are doing in Jungian terms. All of them are doing what Jung said must be done. The lake at Küsnacht still catches the light in the evenings. The tower at Bollingen still stands, its stones fitted by hands that have long since returned to earth. In the archive in Zurich, scholars turn the pages of letters that Jung wrote nearly a century ago, looking for clues, looking for the human being behind the theory. And in the lives of ordinary people around the world, the concepts that Jung articulated continue to work, not because he was perfect, not because he did what he taught, but because the concepts point to something real, something that does not depend on the virtue of the one who first described it. This is how ideas outlive their creators. This is how wisdom survives the failures of the wise. The teacher dies, the institution decays, the scandals are eventually forgotten or forgiven. What remains is the thing itself, the insight, the practice, the door that was opened, the path that was marked. And those who walk the path do not walk it for the teacher's sake. They walk it for their own. The shadow does not care who discovered it. The complexes do not ask for credentials. The archetypes were ancient before any human being gave them names, and will continue long after the last human being has forgotten them. What Jung did, for all his faults, was point. He pointed at something real, and the pointing has value even if the pointer was flawed, even if the hand that pointed was sometimes cruel, even if the man behind the hand never fully became what he described. Perhaps this is the final lesson of Jung's life. Not that wholeness is impossible, but that it is impossibly hard. Not that the shadow can never be integrated, but that integration is a life's work and a life is not enough. Not that the theory is a lie, but that the theory describes an ideal, and ideals are not meant to be achieved. They are meant to orient us. They are meant to give us direction. They are meant to remind us again and again that we're not yet what we might become, and that the distance between who we are and who we might be is the territory where the real work happens. Jung died in 1961, in the house by the lake where he had lived for so many years. He was 85 years old. His wife Emma had died 6 years before. He said that a part of himself had died with her. Tony Wolfe had died in 1953, alone in her apartment, having served his needs for 40 years and having received in return a complicated form of love that satisfied some parts of her and left others forever hungry. The children were grown, scattered, living their own lives with their own shadows to contend with. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren would carry his name forward into a world he would not recognise. In the last years, visitors who came to Küsnacht sometimes found him sitting in his garden, watching the light change on the water, speaking of dreams he had had, of images that still visited him, of the mystery that had occupied him all his life. He was gentler then, they said, softer. Some of the iron had gone out of him. He spoke more often of God, of the numinous, of the reality behind the images. He had always been a religious man in his own strange way, but in the final years the strangeness seemed less important than the religiousness. He wanted, one senses, to be at peace. He wanted to die having integrated what could be integrated, having accepted what could not be, having come as close to wholeness as his nature allowed. Whether he achieved it is not for us to say. The inner life is finally private, finally unknowable from outside. We have the words he wrote, the images he painted, the tower he built with his own hands. We have the testimony of those who knew him, contradictory and incomplete. We have the ideas he left behind, which continue to help people understand themselves, which continue to cause harm when misapplied, which continue to evolve in the hands of those who have taken them up and carried them forward. What we do not have is access to the final reckoning, the moment when the ego confronts the self and gives an account of its stewardship. That reckoning, if it happened, happened in silence, between Jung and whatever he meant by God. The inscription on his gravestone in the little cemetery near his house reads, Vocatus atque non vocatus, Deus aderet. Called or not called, God will be present. It was a motto he had carved above his door at Küsnacht, an ancient oracle he had found in his reading and adopted as his own. It suggests a man who lived with a sense of being watched, being accompanied, being judged by something larger than himself. Whether that watching brought him comfort or terror, in the end we cannot know. Perhaps both. Perhaps the integration of comfort and terror was itself the final task, the one he was still working on when he died. The lake keeps its silence, the mountains hold their snow, and the slow work of understanding goes on, as it has always gone on, in the lives of people who will never know each other, but who are all engaged in the same impossible and necessary project. The attempt to see themselves clearly, to face what they find, and to go on living anyway. There is a quality to the light in the Alps in late afternoon, a particular golden warmth that painters have tried to capture for centuries and never quite succeeded. It was in this light, perhaps, that Jung sat in his garden in those final years, watching the shadows lengthen across the lawn, feeling in his body the approaching end of all projects and all justifications. What does a man think about in such moments? Does he review his accomplishments, count his victories, measure himself against his rivals, or does he simply breathe, simply exist, simply watch the light change and know that soon he will not be there to see it? The testimonies suggest that Jung, in the end, was more interested in what he did not know than in what he did. The mystery had not resolved. The images still came. The unconscious had not been mapped, only approached, only glimpsed, only indicated by a finger pointing at something that always receded as you drew near. He had spent his life trying to bring the darkness into the light, and the darkness remained, patient and vast and full of things he had not understood. This was not a failure. This was the nature of the enterprise. The unconscious is infinite. A human life is not. What he left behind was a way of approaching that infinity. Not a doctrine to be believed, but a method to be practiced. Not answers, but better questions. The question of the shadow. What in myself do I refuse to see? The question of the anima and animus. What qualities have I projected onto others that belong to me? The question of individuation. Am I becoming who I am, or am I living out a pattern someone else imposed on me? The question of the self. Is there something in me that is larger than my ego, wiser than my conscious mind, more whole than my fragmented experience? These questions do not have final answers. They have only the continuous process of asking and the continuous unfolding of whatever answers the asking reveals. The asking never stops. That is perhaps the truest thing that can be said about the life of Carl Gustav Jung, and about the lives of those who have taken up his questions and made them their own. The asking never stops because the psyche never stops moving, never stops producing new material, never stops offering up images and dreams and symptoms and synchronicities that demand interpretation. To live with these questions is to live in a state of permanent inquiry, permanent humility, permanent incompleteness. It is not comfortable. It was never meant to be. And Jung knew this. He knew it in his bones, in the deep ache of a man who had touched something vast and spent the rest of his life trying to communicate what he had found. The difficulty was that the thing he had found could not be communicated directly. It could only be indicated, pointed toward, approached through symbol and metaphor and the slow accumulation of experiential data. You could not hand someone the unconscious the way you could hand them a book. You could only invite them to begin the journey for themselves and hope that they would find, in their own depths, something that corresponded to what you had found in yours. This is why Jung's legacy is so contested, so various, so difficult to assess. He did not leave behind a system that could be applied mechanically. He left behind an invitation to a way of being, and invitations can be accepted or refused, can be understood or misunderstood, can be taken up in the spirit in which they were offered or twisted into something the original speaker would not recognize. All of these things have happened to Jung's ideas. All of them are still happening. In the decades since his death, analytical psychology has spread across the world. There are Jungian institutes now in Zurich, London, New York, San Francisco, Sao Paulo, Tokyo, Melbourne, Cape Town. Thousands of analysts have trained in his methods, have sat with patients in the intimate silence of the consulting room, have listened for the voice of the unconscious in the material presented to them. They have helped people integrate their shadows, have guided them through the terrors of psychological transformation, have witnessed the emergence of the self in lives that had seemed hopelessly fragmented. The work continues. It will continue long after everyone who knew Jung personally has died, long after the last person who shook his hand or heard his voice has passed from the earth. The ideas have taken on a life of their own, as ideas do when they touch something true. But the ideas have also been commodified, simplified, turned into personality tests and self-help formulas and corporate training modules. The introvert-extrovert distinction, which for Jung was a complex description of different orientations toward the world, has become a label on a coffee mug, a category on a dating app, a shorthand that obscures more than it reveals. The archetypes, which for Jung were living powers of the collective psyche, have become characters in marketing presentations, stock figures in Hollywood screenplays, tools for selling products to demographics. The shadow, which for Jung was the terrifying and necessary encounter with everything in yourself you have rejected, has become a buzzword, something people claim to have integrated after a weekend workshop or a particularly vivid journaling session. Jung would have understood this. He understood that every truth, as it passes through the medium of human culture, becomes distorted, simplified, adapted to the needs of those who use it. This is not a corruption of the truth so much as a necessary stage in its transmission. The simplifications serve their purpose. They introduce people to ideas they might never otherwise encounter. And some of those people, a few of them, will feel something stir in response, will sense that there is more to this than the simplified version suggests, will begin the journey inward that the simplification only hinted at. The funnel is wide at the top and narrow at the bottom. Most people stay near the surface, a few descend. This is how it has always been with esoteric knowledge, with any teaching that requires personal transformation rather than mere intellectual assent. The question that remains is whether Jung's specific formulations will survive, or whether they will be absorbed into some larger synthesis, some future psychology, that takes what was useful from his work and leaves the rest behind. This is already happening in a way. The field of depth psychology has expanded far beyond the boundaries Jung set for it. New research in neuroscience, in trauma studies, in attachment theory, in the biology of emotion has added layers of understanding that Jung could not have anticipated. His model of the psyche, with its persona and shadow and anima and self, is now one model among many, useful for some purposes and not for others. The collective unconscious, his most radical and controversial claim, remains unproven by any standard scientific method, and yet it continues to resonate with people who have encountered, in their own experience, something that seems to match his description. Perhaps it is a metaphor for something real that we do not yet have better words for. Perhaps it is exactly what he said it was. Perhaps we will never know, because the instruments required to measure it have not yet been invented, or because the thing itself is not the kind of thing that can be measured. What is certain is that something happened to Carl Jung. Something happened in those years after his break with Freud, something that transformed him from a talented young psychiatrist into whatever he became. You can call it a psychotic break, a spiritual emergency, a shamanic initiation, a creative illness, an encounter with the archetypal layer of the psyche. You can call it madness, or you can call it revelation. The labels matter less than the fact of it. The undeniable reality that this man went somewhere most people do not go, saw things most people do not see, and came back with reports that have helped and harmed in roughly equal measure ever since. The Red Book sits now in a vault in Zurich, the original manuscript, that leather-bound volume filled with his paintings and his calligraphy and his dialogues with the figures of his unconscious. It was published in 2009 in a massive facsimile edition that weighs nearly 10 pounds, and it has been studied and analysed and debated ever since. Some readers find it profound, a genuine record of an encounter with the numinous. Others find it grandiose, self-indulgent, the product of a mind that had lost its moorings. Both readings are possible, both may be true. The Red Book does not explain itself. It simply presents the images, the voices, the journey, and leaves the reader to make of it what they can. There is a passage early in the book where Jung describes the beginning of his descent. He writes of a spirit of the depths who has seized him, who will not let him go, who demands that he abandon the spirit of the time, the surface concerns of his professional life, and enter the depths of his own soul. The language is biblical, prophetic, deliberately archaic. He is writing himself into a mythic narrative, casting his breakdown as a vocation, his suffering as a calling. This is either the highest courage or the most elaborate self-deception, and perhaps there is no difference between them at a certain level of intensity. When the psyche breaks open, it needs a story to hold the fragments. Jung gave himself that story. Whether it was the right story, the true story, the story that served his healing or prevented it, no one can say for certain. What we can say is that he emerged. He came back from wherever he had gone and spent the next 40 years building a life and a theory on the foundation of what he had experienced. The building was imperfect, full of the tensions and contradictions we have traced. But it stood. It held weight. People lived in it, found shelter in it, grew in it. That counts for something. That counts for a great deal. And the man himself, in his final years, seemed to have found a kind of peace. Not the peace of resolution, not the peace of having answered all the questions, but the peace of having lived the questions fully, of having given everything he had to the inquiry. He had built his tower at Bollingen, carved his inscriptions in the stone, planted his garden, tended his fire. He had written his books, trained his students, loved and been hurt by the people who were close to him. He had faced his shadow, at least in part, at least as much as any human being can face the darkness within. He had sought the self, whatever the self might be, and he had found something, even if that something resisted final description. There is a photograph from his last years that captures something essential. He's sitting in his study, surrounded by books, his face deeply lined, his eyes looking at something beyond the camera. He does not look happy exactly, but he does not look unhappy either. He looks like a man who has seen too much to be surprised by anything anymore, who has travelled too far to expect the journey to have a destination. He looks like a man who has made his peace with mystery. The last summer of his life, in 1961, he was working on a final essay, one that would not be completed before his death. It was about flying saucers, about the reports of unidentified objects in the sky that had become so common in the post-war years. Jung saw in these reports something psychological, a projection of the collective unconscious onto the heavens, a modern myth taking shape before our eyes. It was a strange subject for a man in his 80s to devote his remaining strength to, and yet it was also perfectly characteristic. He was still following the images, still tracking the movements of the collective psyche, still trying to understand what humanity was dreaming about and why. The work did not stop because he was dying. The work does not stop. He died on June 6, 1961, at his home in Küsnacht. He was 85 years old. The day before his death, according to some accounts, he had asked to be taken to the window so he could look out at the lake one last time. The lake he had lived beside for more than 50 years, the lake that had witnessed his greatest achievements and his deepest struggles, the lake that reflected the sky and held its secrets in silence. He looked at it for a long time. Then he was carried back to his bed, and he did not speak again. The funeral was private. His family and closest students gathered at the house, then accompanied the coffin to the cemetery at the Reformed Church in Küsnacht. The headstone was placed where it still stands today, bearing the inscription he had chosen, the oracle that had guided his life. Called or not called, God will be present. There was no grand ceremony, no public eulogy from the psychological establishment he had helped to create. He had wanted it that way. He had always been suspicious of institutions, of collective honours, of anything that threatened to turn a living reality into a fixed doctrine. Better to let the work speak for itself. Better to let the dead bury the dead and the living continue the journey, and the living have continued. In the 60-plus years since his death, the study of the psyche has expanded in ways he could not have imagined. We have brain imaging technologies now that allow us to watch the mind at work. We have vast databases of dreams that can be analysed for patterns. We have cross-cultural studies that test his hypotheses about archetypes against the mythologies of peoples around the world. We have therapies derived from his methods that help trauma survivors integrate dissociated parts of themselves. We have criticisms of his work that expose its limitations, its biases, its blind spots. We have everything except the man himself, sitting in his study with his pipe and his careful silences, asking the questions that only he knew how to ask. This is always the way with great thinkers. They leave behind their words, their theories, their influence, but they take with them the living presence that animated all of it, the irreducible humanity that no text can capture. To read Jung is not to know Jung. To study his ideas is not to understand the man who produced them. There was something in him that exceeded his formulations, that lived in the spaces between his concepts, that flickered in the margins of his manuscripts and disappeared when you tried to look at it directly. This is the mystery at the heart of any human being, the self that cannot be reduced to its expressions. Jung spent his life trying to describe this mystery, and he succeeded well enough that millions of people have benefited from his descriptions. But the mystery itself remains, as it must remain because that is its nature. The moment you think you have captured it, it has moved somewhere else. So we are left with questions. We are left with a man who sought wholeness and achieved only partial integration, who preached the confrontation with shadow and harboured shadows he never fully acknowledged, who revolutionised our understanding of the psyche and left behind a body of work that is as flawed and valuable as any human production can be. We are left with his books, his letters, his paintings, his tower. We are left with the tradition he founded and the criticisms that tradition has attracted. We are left with the invitation to do the work ourselves, to descend into our own depths, to face what we find there, and to come back with whatever gifts we can bring. This is not a comfortable inheritance. It demands too much. It offers no guarantees. It cannot be completed. It can only be continued. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the work of becoming who you are is not meant to be finished in a single lifetime. Perhaps it passes from generation to generation, each taking up where the last left off, each adding something to the collective understanding, each failing in their own particular way and succeeding in their own particular way, contributing to a project that has no end because the psyche itself has no end, because the unconscious is infinite and we are not. The lake at Zurich is still there. It reflects the Alps in winter, catches the light in summer, freezes occasionally in the coldest years. The house at Küsnacht is still there too, though it has passed through other hands now, other lives. The tower at Bollingen still stands, its stone walls weathering slowly, its inscriptions still legible to those who make the journey to see them. These are the physical traces he left behind, the marks on the landscape that say a man was here. A man thought and suffered and loved and built. A man tried to understand. The marks will fade eventually. Stone crumbles. Houses are demolished. Lakes change their courses over geological time. Nothing we build is permanent. This too is part of the teaching. But the ideas do not require physical monuments to survive. They live in the minds that hold them, in the conversations that transmit them, in the books that preserve them for readers not yet born. And more than that, they live in the depths of the psyche itself, in the archetypes that were there before Jung named them, and will be there long after his names have been forgotten. The shadow does not care whether anyone remembers Carl Jung. The anima does not read books about analytical psychology. The self is indifferent to the history of the movement that claimed to describe it. These are powers, not concepts. They work in us whether we acknowledge them or not. Jung's contribution was to bring them into consciousness, to give us language for experiences that had always been present but never adequately described. The language is imperfect. Language always is, but it points towards something real, and that is enough. In the end, what can be said of Carl Gustav Jung is what can be said of any human being who tried to live fully and fell short of their own ideals. He was both more and less than he appeared. More, because the depths he touched are genuinely profound, because the help he offered to those who are suffering is real, because the questions he asked will continue to be asked as long as there are human beings with inner lives. Less because he was a man of his time and his culture, with the limitations that implies, because he hurt people who trusted him, because he failed to see in himself what he was so adept at seeing in others. He was, in other words, human. Magnificently, terribly, ordinarily human. And his work invites us to be human too, with all that entails. The shadow you refuse to see is still there, waiting. The parts of yourself you have exiled are still knocking at the door. The dream you forgot this morning still carries a message you need to hear. The life you're living is still asking you whether it is truly yours, or whether you're living out a pattern that someone else imposed on you. These questions do not require you to become a Jungian or to accept every claim Jung ever made. They only require you to turn inward, to pay attention, to take seriously the evidence of your own experience. The unconscious is speaking. It is always speaking. The only question is whether you will listen. Outside, the night is quiet. The darkness that seemed so threatening when you lay down to sleep is simply darkness now. The same darkness that has fallen every night since the earth began to turn. The same darkness that will fall long after you and everyone you know has passed from memory. It holds nothing that is not already in you. It asks nothing except that you acknowledge its presence. Make room for it. Let it be part of the wholeness you are seeking. This is the final teaching, if there is a final teaching, that the light and the dark belong together, that you cannot have one without the other, that the integration you seek is not the triumph of light over dark, but the marriage of both, the union of opposites that Jung placed at the centre of his vision. Called or not called, God will be present. Called or not called, the unconscious will speak. Called or not called, the work will continue in you and through you and after you, as it continued through the man who carved those words above his door and lived beneath them for half a century, waiting for the presence that was always already there, looking for the self that was always already looking back. The lake holds its silence. The mountains hold their snow. And somewhere, in a house by the water's edge, a light goes out and the darkness comes in, and the slow work of dreaming begins again.